7 men died in a mine shaft in Montana. The investigation found no negligence. The names were removed from the official report. The company kept operating. The foreman kept giving orders. And the man who had written those names in his original report walked away to raise horses in silence and told himself that was enough. But in St. Louis, an accountant named Thomas McBride had been quietly, carefully, at a kitchen table by lamplight, putting those names back. And when they killed him for it, his wife picked up the notebook. And she ran. In a blizzard, 8 months pregnant, with 2 children and a dislocated shoulder. And she did not stop. This channel tells the stories that were almost lost, of love fierce enough to outrun grief, of strangers who choose the harder road, of truth that refuses to stay buried no matter how much power is used to bury it. Some people leave the world with less truth in it than they found. Thomas McBride left it with more. That is the whole measure of a life. Subscribe, share this with someone who still believes in people, and drop a comment. Because this story deserves to travel as far as those 7 names finally did.
Cole Hargrove had one simple rule about the East Ridge Road in winter. He stayed off it. It was a dead end that led to the Piton mining trail and nowhere else. The only folks on that road in a blizzard were tied to the mine or running from it. Cole was neither. He was just checking a downed fence line, but his old dog, Deputy, kept pulling him toward the ridge. Arguing with that 13-year-old hound was a fool's errand. He smelled the busted wagon before he laid eyes on it. The scent of pine and wet canvas, sharp and clear. Then his horse spooked, and Cole saw them down the slope. A woman on her knees, wrapping her children in her arms, her dark coat spread over them like a mother hen's wings. She was not looking down, she was staring up at the ridge, watching those lanterns sweep back and forth. Cole had been a lawman once, and the old instincts kicked in. Those men were not searching, they were closing a trap. They knew she was down there somewhere. The woman knew it too. She was staying quiet, staying low, hoping the heavy snow would hide the wreckage before they found it. He could just turn his horse and ride on, check that fence, and no one would ever know he was there. But Deputy let out a low noise, a sound that said he had already made up his mind and was just waiting on his human to get with the program. Then the little girl peeked out from her brother's shoulder, and her eyes locked right onto Cole's through the swirling snow. She did not cry or make a sound. She just watched him, steady and serious. Cole swung down from his horse. "Ma'am," he said, his voice low enough to stay under the wind, "do not move a muscle. I am coming down slow." Her head snapped toward him. He could tell by the set of her shoulders she was in a world of pain and ignoring every bit of it. "How many?" she asked, her voice tight. "3 up on the ridge. Maybe more." 2 more came from the south, she told him. "They are trying to block off the creek road." Cole squinted and saw she was right. A 4th lantern was moving through the trees. In the middle of a blizzard, hurt and scared, she had already figured out their whole plan. "My ranch is about a mile west of here. There is a draw that will keep us hidden from the ridge," he said, crouching beside her. "But we have to go now, or they will spot us." She studied his face, her eyes searching for any hint of a lie. "You live out here all alone?" she asked. "Yes, ma'am." "Then why are you helping us?" It was the right question to ask. "Because if I ride on by," he said, "I will not sleep right for a good long while, and I already have enough trouble with that." He glanced at her shoulder. "That needs to be set, and not out here in the cold." She held his gaze for a second more, then turned to her son. "James, take your sister's hand." The boy, who looked to be 8 or 9, gave Cole a quick, measuring look before taking his little sister's hand without a word. They made their way through the draw, with Cole and his horse blocking them from view. The woman, whose name he still did not know, walked on her own 2 feet. He offered an arm, but she refused it until the ground turned slick with ice. She grabbed his sleeve to steady herself, then let go the second she was stable again. The little girl looked up at his horse. "What is her name?" she asked. "Pepper," he answered. That is a good name, the girl said, then pointed at the dog limping ahead. And deputy is a good name, too. How did you know his name? He just looks like a deputy, she said, like it was the most obvious thing in the world. Cole's ranch was cold and dark, but the stove lit up quick. Soon he had a fire roaring and water heating. He pulled out some blankets his mother had sent him years ago, blankets he never had a reason to use until now. The little girl, Clara, was asleep before the first blanket even settled on her. Her brother, James, sat straight-backed beside her, his eyes glued on Cole. He was watchful the way a boy gets when he has had to be the man of the house for too long. The woman sat at the table, clutching a leather bag she had not put down once. Cole set a cup of hot water in front of her. I am fresh out of coffee, he said. This is fine. She wrapped her hands around the warmth of the cup, closed her eyes for just a moment, and then was back. Your shoulder needs to go back in, he told her gently. I can count to 3, or I can just get it over with. She looked him right in the eye. Something in her face softened, just a little, like she had not been asked what she wanted in a long, long time. Just do it, she said. He set the joint with one quick, clean move. She made a single sharp sound, and then there was only the crackling of the fire. Thank you, she said, her voice steady as a rock. What is your name, ma'am? Eleanor McBride. My husband was Thomas McBride. He handled the books for Peton Mining. He is dead now. Cole sat down across the table from her. 8 months ago, she said, her voice flat. They called the cave-in at shaft number 3 an accident. Peton is real good at making things look like accidents. Where are you headed with these children? To Billings. There is a federal judge there my husband trusted. She glanced down at the bag in her lap. I have his notebook. Thomas wrote everything down. Names, dates, payouts, all the dirty business Peton has been into for the last 4 years. She looked up, her eyes burning into his, including what really happened with the Colville collapse. The name hit Cole like a physical blow, a ghost from a past he thought he had buried deep. What do you know about Colville? He asked, his voice low. I know 7 men died, she said, and the company's investigation found nobody was to blame. They called it negligence, she said, sliding a folded newspaper clipping across the table. Her voice was steady as a rock. But a Pinkerton detective named Cole Hargrove wrote a report that named Peton. That report got buried and Hargrove quit rather than sign a lie. She looked him square in the eye. My husband, Thomas, believed you were telling the truth. He kept a copy of your report and he kept your name. Cole didn't so much as touch the paper. How long have you known who I am? He asked. Since you said your name on that ridge. Thomas made sure I memorized it. Her knuckles were scraped raw. They left my husband in a mine shaft and called him careless. They've been chasing me for 4 days because I took this notebook instead of sitting quiet and mourning. Her jaw set hard. Well, I am not mourning quietly. Cole saw the faint ink stains on her hand from writing for hours on end, and how she sat with a clear path to the door. There's a federal marshal, a fellow named Garrett, Cole said. He works the Northern Territory, and he's too mean and stubborn to be bought. I know how to reach him. Eleanor just stared at him, her eyes searching. Why would you do that? It was a real question, asked by a woman who had learned the hard way not to expect a helping hand. Cole glanced down at his own name in the faded print. He remembered the night his boss handed him a doctored report and told him to sign. He had just felt tired of being a cog in a machine that ground good people into dust. He had told himself walking away was enough, but that had been a lie for 2 long years. Your husband had 7 names in his notebook, Cole said, meeting her gaze. The men from Cleville. I wrote those same names in my original report, and someone made them disappear. How did Thomas find them? Eleanor paused for a moment. He went to the families, she said softly. He spent 3 months finding the family of every man who died. He said someone should have done it a long time ago, she finished. Cole let that sink in. Outside, the blizzard was howling like a cornered animal, but the fire inside the little cabin held its ground. "You and the children need to get some sleep," he finally said. "That pass to Billings has been closed since Sunday. We will not be moving for at least 3 days, maybe 5. He got to his feet. "You rest. In the morning you need to eat. And let me look at that shoulder. Then you can tell me everything that is in that notebook." She studied his face, looking for the angle, the hidden price. "There is a bolt on top of the door," he told her, "and a latch at the bottom. Slide them both, and nobody gets in without waking you." He added, "I will be sleeping in the barn with Deputy and the horses." For the first time, a flicker of something new crossed her face. It was the look of a woman who had been managed and maneuvered for months and was suddenly handed something as simple as a choice. "Cole," she said. It was the first time she had used his name. He did not make a thing of it. "If Petton's men are out there, this storm is too heavy for them to move tonight. They will wait it out. That means you are safe for now. Sleep while you can." He picked up his rifle and moved toward the door. "Mister," the quiet voice came from her son, James. The boy was still sitting bolt upright beside his sleeping sister. "You are going to stand watch," James said. It was not a question. "Yes, son." The boy nodded slowly, looking from his mother back to Cole. "My father used to stand watch," he said, when he found something worth protecting." Cole gave no answer. He just opened the door, and the blizzard roared into the room for a cold second. Then he was gone, and the door clicked shut. He heard both locks slide home, top and bottom, just like he told her. He stood on the porch in the swirling white dark. Inside that cabin was Eleanor McBride, 8 months pregnant, with 2 sleeping children and a book full of truth. She was alive because a 13-year-old dog pulled on a leash. He thought about Thomas McBride spending 3 months finding those names. He thought about how a man can walk away from something and spend 2 years telling himself it was enough. The snow was coming down hard, trying to cover up the whole world and start over. But Cole knew it did not work that way. Underneath all that clean white, the proof of every bad deed was still right where it had been left. And in the morning, a woman who refused to mourn quietly was going to help him dig it all back up. The cold finally drove him inside around 2 in the morning. Not the temperature, but the kind of deep cold that gets in a man's joints and makes his hands slow. He expected the cabin to be dark, but Eleanor was at the table with a lantern turned down low. Her pencil was moving across the pages of a new notebook. "I told you to sleep," he said. "I am making a copy," she said without looking up, "in case they get the original. 2 copies are harder to make disappear." He sat down at the other end of the table. Her handwriting was small and clear, a school teacher's hand. "Thomas taught you that," he guessed. "Make copies." A brief pause in her writing. "Thomas taught me a lot of things. He said the most dangerous document is the only document." She turned a page. "He said powerful men do not destroy evidence. They destroy the people who hold it. So I am making sure there is more than one person holding it." The fire had settled to coals, and the cabin was deep down quiet. "The men on that ridge," Cole said softly. "You recognize the way they moved. That is not something a person figures out by accident." Eleanor's pencil stopped. She did not look up right away. When she did, her face had changed. She was deciding, right then and there, how much of the whole truth to tell. "They have been following me since St. Louis," she said. "It started the week after Thomas died. I went to his office to collect his things and found the notebook. He had hidden it inside a ledger for me to find. The apartment looked fine, like nobody had touched a thing. But I remembered what Thomas told me. He said, 'If they ever come looking, you check the sugar tin, the lining of my winter coat, and behind the 3rd board in the study.'" Eleanor's voice was steady. "I found 3 different sets of papers he had been hiding for months." Cole stayed quiet, letting it sink in. Thomas knew they were coming for him. He just did not know when. Her voice got low and heavy, the way it does when words are hard to carry. "He left me a letter in that coat, tucked right in with the papers. He told me exactly where to go, who I could trust, and how to move without being seen. He told me to take the children and not look back. He wrote it all so calmly, like he had all the time in the world. But he knew he was going to die. He used his last few hours to write me a way out. "He sure loved you," Cole said softly. "He was a practical man," she answered. But the way she said it, Cole knew she understood that Thomas McBride had been both. Cole got up and put a couple more logs on the fire, not because it was cold yet, but because he needed to do something with his hands. When he sat back down, Eleanor was already writing again. "The names on the left," she said without looking up. "Those are the men Peaton paid off to say that Cowville shaft was safe just 6 weeks before it all came down. The column on the right is how much they took." She slid the book toward him. Thomas did not miss a thing. He checked it all twice. Cole stared at the page. The numbers were exact, down to the penny. The kind that only come from real records. His hands froze. That third name, Harlan Driscoll, the county sheriff. "You know him?" she asked, watching his face. "He's the sheriff right here in this county," Cole said, leaning back. "He came by a couple of months ago over a fence line dispute. He saw the amount next to Driscoll's name, $400. Peaton was buying his silence before the first shovel hit the dirt," she said. It was all becoming clear to Cole now. This was not just about cutting corners. It was a whole crooked system planned out from the start. They had inspectors and a sheriff bought and paid for. And when Thomas McBride found out, they put him in the ground. "Your shoulder," Cole said, changing the subject. "That fall you took from the wagon." He hated to ask, but he had to. "Are you sure the baby is all right?" Eleanor went completely still. For just a second, he saw the real woman behind the strong front she put up. "I do not know," she said, and it sounded like the words cost her something. "I have felt movement, but not as much." "Then it is likely fine," he said, keeping his voice even. "The cold slows things down. But you tell me if that changes." She picked her pencil back up. "I do not play stubborn when it counts." A hint of a smile touched her voice. "Thomas used to say I had the kind of stubbornness a woman gets from being told no one too many times." Cole almost smiled back. "Sounds like he was a smart man." "Smarter than me about people," she said, turning a page. He knew if someone was worth a damn inside of 5 minutes. The silence in the room changed. "He would have trusted you." Cole did not say anything. "How do you know that?" "Because he kept your name," she said, looking right at him. "Thomas did not keep the names of men he did not believe in. Your name was right there on the second page he wrote. He put you with the victims, not with the witnesses." The fire crackled in the hearth. The blizzard outside seemed to be settling in for the long haul, content to just wait them out. But Cole was not the kind of man who gave up. "I need to tell you about Claville," he said. "You do not owe me anything." "I need to tell you anyway." He waited for her to put the pencil down. "When I first wrote my report, I had everything. I had pictures of the shoddy supports. I had statements from 3 miners who survived. I had enough proof to shut Peaton down for good." Eleanor listened without moving. "My boss told me to hand it all over, that it was being handled higher up. He told me to trust the system." Cole's jaw was tight. "So I did. I gave them everything. 3 weeks later, he hands me a new report, completely clean. Said my proof was inconclusive. And at the bottom it said if I wanted to keep my job, I had to sign it." "And you walked out," she said. "I walked out," he confirmed. "I told myself that was the right thing to do, that my hands were clean because I did not sign their lie. But I took my files with me, locked them away, and told myself that just walking away was enough." He finally looked at her, the weight of 2 years in his eyes. "It was not. But it just was not enough. 7 men were still dead. Peaton kept on with his business, so I found a quiet little piece of the world and tried to forget." Eleanor studied him for a good long while. Then she asked, "Where are the files?" He met her gaze. "The proof, the pictures, the stories, that copy of the inspection report." She leaned in just a little. "Where are they?" he told her. "In the cedar chest, right there under my bed." The look that crossed Eleanor McBride's face was not about winning, and it was not about comfort. It was the look of a woman who has carried a crushing burden for 8 months and just discovered someone else was there to help lift it. "Cole," she said, "your file's put together with Thomas's notebook. That's enough to see him hang." Cole just said, "Yes, ma'am, I know." They looked at one another. The lantern between them burned low and steady while the blizzard raged outside. Something inside that room had changed. It was not just between them. The heavy, dangerous thing they were both carrying was still there. But now the weight was shared. And that changes everything. From the shadows, James McBride spoke up. "How long have you been awake?" Cole asked him. "A good while." The boy sat right up. His voice was careful, not like a child, but like someone who had learned the hard way to measure his words. "I heard what you were saying about Claville." Eleanor said his name, a soft warning in her voice. "He ought to know," James told his mother, not with defiance, but with certainty. "He is helping us, so he ought to know what he is getting into." Cole looked at that boy, all of 8 years old, who already understood that a fair deal means telling the whole story. He was Thomas McBride's son, through and through. "What is it you want to know?" Cole asked. James took a moment to think it all through. He asked, "Those men who were following us, the ones up on the ridge, are they coming here?" "Not tonight," Cole told him. "The storm is too rough. Maybe in the morning." "And what about the sheriff, the one in your book?" "He is the sheriff right here," his mother confirmed, "so we cannot go to him for help." "No." James took that in. He looked back at Cole. "But you know other people, folks who are not on Peaton's payroll." "I know one fella," Cole said. "A federal marshal named Garrett. He is 3 days east of here if the weather is clear. But the weather is not clear. Still, you can get a message to him." "I can, if Driscoll has not already gotten to the telegraph man in Copper Falls." Cole told Eleanor, "That is the plan. At first light, I will ride to town and send that wire. I will be back before Peaton's men can pull themselves together." "That will leave us here by ourselves," James pointed out. "James," his mother started to say. "I'm not complaining," the boy said. "I'm thinking it through." He looked at Cole with those serious dark eyes. "What should we do if someone shows up while you are gone?" Cole leaned in, looked that boy square in the eye, and gave him the straight truth. He said, "There is a rifle underneath the bed, and it is loaded. Your mother knows how to handle it." He glanced at Eleanor, and she gave a single firm nod. "If anybody comes knocking on that door before I get back, you do not answer it. You do not open it for anyone. You take your sister to the back wall, and you let your mother take care of the door." He held the boy's gaze. "Your job is to look after your sister. That has not changed. Do you understand me?" James looked at him for 3 solid seconds before he nodded. "Go on back to sleep now," Eleanor said softly. James laid back down, his arm going right back over his little sister, Clara. In just a few minutes, his breathing was slow and even. Cole wondered how that boy could just turn it all off and go to sleep, like a soldier who had learned to catch his rest whenever he could. Eleanor watched her son for a long time after he was asleep. The look on her face was raw and honest, like people get when they think no one can see them. It was a mix of grief and pride, the kind a mother feels watching her child grow up too fast under awful pressure. She did not know whether to feel thankful or heartbroken. Cole saw it all, and he did not look away. He had a feeling she would not want him to pretend. "He is just 8 years old," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I know. He was only 6 when the trouble started for Thomas at the mine. For 2 whole years he has watched me be scared." She reached for the pencil. "And in all that time, he has never let me see him be scared, not even once." "Oh, he is afraid," Cole said. "He has just figured out that being afraid does not do him much good. That is exactly what I mean." She looked down at the notebook. A boy his age should not have to figure that out. Cole did not say a word. She was right, and there was nothing to add. He stood up and walked over to his mother's old cedar chest. He knelt down and lifted the false bottom he had built in it years ago. Old habits from his Pinkerton days just did not want to leave him. He pulled out the files, still wrapped in oilskin and tied with string, looking just like they did the day he took them from the Chicago office. He placed them on the table. Eleanor looked at them, but she did not reach for them. She looked at him first. "Are you certain?" "I have been certain for 2 years now," he said. "I just had not decided to do a thing about it." She untied the string, opened the flap, and looked at the first photograph. Cole watched her face as she studied the picture of the mineshaft supports, seeing the cuts in the wood where braces had been taken out to save a little money. She took it all in quickly, seeing the big picture before she focused on the details. Then she turned to the pages of testimony and started to read. She read for 40 minutes straight without a single word. Cole added more wood to the fire, made some hot water, and set a cup beside her. She drank it without even looking up from the pages. Outside, the blizzard was starting to change. It was not getting lighter yet, but the darkness was shifting from pure black to that deep gray blue that comes right before the dawn in a Montana winter. When she was done, she put the last page down and laid her hands flat on the table. "His name," she said. "The foreman who told them to take out the braces. Marcus Hall. Yes, he is in Thomas's notebook, too. He is still on Peaton's payroll. He is running the new operation up north of Billings." She pressed her palms down hard on the table. "He gave that order. 7 men died, and now he's in charge of 300 more men in a new mine." "I know." She looked right at him. "This all has to stop." "Yes," he agreed. "I mean every last bit of it. Not just putting Peaton in a courtroom. Hall, Driscoll, every single name on that list. All of it has to end. That is what federal courts are for," he told her. "That is why we have to get Garrett." She was quiet for a moment, then she asked, "Cole, what if Garrett has been bought too?" It was the right question to ask. It was the same question he had been wrestling with since he heard Driscoll's name. A person starts asking questions like that when they have lived around corruption long enough to stop assuming anyone is clean. "He might be," Cole answered honestly. "But I have watched Garrett work for 12 years. I have never seen him take a dime that was not his, and I have seen men try to buy him." He met her eyes. "Some men just cannot be bought. Not because they are saints, but because they are too angry to be. Garrett's brother died in a mine collapse back in Pennsylvania, and he has been mad about it since 1869. Peaton would have to offer him a whole lot more than money to buy that man's loyalty." Eleanor looked at him for a long moment. Then you could see something settle inside her. It was not peace, not really. It was the feeling a person gets when they have made a choice and are done looking back. "Send the wire when the sun comes up," she said. "First light," he promised. She picked her pencil back up and went back to work. Cole leaned back and kept watch. The children were sleeping, the fire was holding, and the truth was spread all across the table. For 2 years, they had been holding 2 halves of the same story, never knowing the other was out there. Sleep was the last thing on Cole's mind. Something inside him had clicked on in the last 3 hours, like an old rusted engine groaning back to life. It wasn't a good feeling. It was the ache of a broken thing forcing itself to work again. As the first hint of gray light touched the sky, he reached for his coat. Eleanor looked up. He told her he would be back in a couple of hours. She gave a single nod. He paused, and she spoke. "The telegraph operator in Copper Falls is named Everett Kay. He is 60 years old with a daughter in Billings. Peaton's foreman made sure her husband lost his job after he complained about the mines." She met his gaze. "Peaton does not own him. Tell him Eleanor McBride sent you." Cole stared at her for a moment. "Thomas," he said. "Thomas," she confirmed. "He knew everyone." Cole put on his coat and grabbed the rifle by the door. He glanced back at the table where Eleanor McBride sat in the dim Montana dawn, 8 months pregnant, pencils still moving. Her 2 sleeping children were behind her, and her husband's work was laid out before her. It was a map she would follow to its very end. He opened the door and the cold poured in. Without looking up, Eleanor said, "Make sure Driscoll does not see you." He replied, "No, ma'am." He stepped out and pulled the door shut. He heard both bolts slide into place behind him. Cole stood in the quiet morning after the storm. The fresh snow made everything look clean and new. He thought of a foreman named Hall and a sheriff named Driscoll. He thought of a man in Billings who had been paying off safety inspectors since 1875, calling the deaths of good men accidents. He thought of Thomas McBride writing instructions for his wife by lamplight, knowing his time was short. He thought about 7 names, written and erased and carried in secret by 2 different people for 2 long years. He walked to the barn, saddled his horse Pepper, and rode toward Copper Falls. The world looked pure, but it was all a lie. Everett Carr was already at his desk when Cole walked into the telegraph office. That meant he had not slept either. Word had already spread through Copper Falls, not by wire, but by whispers in the dark. The old man looked up, a coffee cup in his hand. He had the face of a man expecting a guest he was not sure he wanted. Cole closed the door, dripping melted snow onto the floor. "Eleanor McBride sent me," he said. Everett Carr put his cup down. A look of recognition crossed his face. He looked like a man who had been waiting for a specific knock on his door for a long time. Kane said, "Sit down and speak softly. Driscoll's deputy sleeps right across the street, and that man hears everything." Cole sat down. He kept his voice low and told him the whole story. He spoke of the woman, the children, the notebook, and the urgent need to wire Marshal Garrett in Billings before Paton's men found out where Eleanor was. Kane listened without a single interruption, the way a good telegraph operator does. He took in the entire message before he even thought to reply. When Cole finished, Kane picked up his pencil. "Garrett is not in Billings," he said. Cole froze. "He came through here 4 days ago, headed north. The storm trapped him at Ridgeline Station." Kane wrote while he talked. "I got a wire from the operator there yesterday. Garrett is stuck just like the rest of us." He looked up. "But that means he is 2 hours north, not 3 days east. And he has been looking for a reason to move." Kane paused. "I may have mentioned to the Ridgeline operator that some things of federal interest might be happening down here." Cole stared at him. "You knew about Eleanor." Kane kept writing. "I knew a woman was being hunted on the East Ridge Road. My granddaughter saw the lanterns from her window. I have just been waiting for someone to walk through that door with a name I could trust." He tore the page from his pad. "This will get to Garrett in the next 5 minutes. He can be here before noon." "What about Driscoll?" "Driscoll does not see my real transmissions," Kane said, his voice hard as iron. "He thinks he does. For 8 months he has received a perfect copy of my log, minus the parts he is not supposed to see." He met Cole's eyes. "My daughter's husband was a good man who asked one too many questions. Some of us do not have the choice to just walk away." Cole accepted that, because it was the truth. "Send the wire," Cole said. Kane sent it. Cole was back at the ranch well before the hour was up. He put Pepper in the barn, walked to the cabin door, and knocked a special pattern. The bolt slid back, and Eleanor opened the door with the rifle held ready at her side. She looked at him, her question unspoken. "Garrett is 2 hours north," he said. "He is stuck at Ridgeline. Kane sent him a wire. He should be here by noon." A flicker of relief crossed Eleanor's face, gone as fast as it appeared. "Kane knew," she said. "He has been waiting." She stepped aside to let him inside. The cabin was different. The files and notebook were gone from the clean table. Her son James stood at the window watching the south. Her daughter Clara was awake on the blankets, eating a piece of dried biscuit she had found. "There is a man at the edge of the southern trees," James said without turning. "He has been there for 20 minutes, just watching." Cole went to the window and saw the boy was right. A single man stood 200 yards away, just watching. "One that I can see," James clarified, "just like a trained scout would." Cole glanced at Eleanor. They are waiting for Driscoll, she said, or for more of their men to show up. Cole stepped away from the window. Either way, they will make a move before Garrett gets here. We have to be ready. He looked at James. You know what to do. Back wall. Take your sister. James replied, I heard you the first time. Eleanor's voice was calm. James, take Clara to the back room now. I need to talk to Cole, and I need to know you both are safe. The boy obeyed, leading his sister to the other room and closing the door. Eleanor turned to Cole. How many men does Piton have around here? I know of 6, he answered, checking his rifle. But Piton will not come himself. He sends men to do his dirty work. When his paperwork does not get him what he wants, he sends more men. The paperwork will not work, Eleanor stated. He has no legal claim on me. The notebook is Thomas's private property. He does not need it to be legal, Cole said flatly. He just needs it done before Garrett shows up. The grim understanding passed between them. Outside, the man in the trees had not moved. Cole's dog, Deputy, stood by the door, coiled and ready. He had seen the dog like this before a fight. It was a reliable sign. How is your shoulder this morning? Cole asked. I can manage, she answered. And the baby? She met his eyes. Moving more than last night. He felt a wave of relief, which he pushed aside to deal with later. There is something else, she said. When Thomas sent me the letter telling me where to go, he included another name. She folded her hands on the table. It was not a person to find. It was a person to avoid. She looked toward the door. He wrote that if I made it to Montana, there was one man whose help would be more valuable than anyone else's. One man with the proof and the reason to stand up in a federal court and make sure everyone knew what happened at the Colville mine. She told him, your husband left a message for you. He said to find Cole Hargrove and tell him the men of Claville are still waiting for their names to be heard. Cole just stared out the window. He could feel trouble brewing. Out in the trees, a second man had joined the first. They weren't just watching anymore. They were fixing to make a move, using the trees for cover in a way that set a man on edge. Eleanor came up right beside him. How long they been out there, she asked. Maybe 10 minutes, he answered, then turned right around. Where did you put those files? Same place you had them, she said. She walked over to an old cedar chest, knelt, and lifted a hidden panel in the bottom. There it was, his oilskin pouch next to her husband's notebook and the stacks of copied papers. She put the panel back in place. If they come in fast, they won't find it. He picked up his rifle. Honey, I'm not worried about them being fast. Eleanor, Cole said, his voice low and steady. She turned to face him. I'm going to ask you to do something that'll go against every bone in your body. When they get here, and believe me, they are coming, I need you to let me answer that door. Don't you stand behind it, and don't you hold that rifle. You let me handle the front, and you trust me to hold them off till Garrett arrives. And if he doesn't get here in time, she asked, her arms crossed, then I'll hold them off anyway. With what authority? You're a rancher, not a lawman. I've got the Claville documents in your husband's own words right here in this house, he said. The second that federal marshal walks through the door, everything in here becomes federal evidence, and every man who tried to get to it becomes a federal problem. But that only works if we're all still standing when he shows up. She looked him up and down, thinking it through. You could see her weighing every single risk. All right, she finally said. All right. She moved to the back room. James? The door opened right away. The boy had been waiting. Eleanor knelt down and put her hands on her son's shoulders, looking him square in the eye. I need you to listen real close. The men outside, they work for the man who hurt your father. They want what's in that chest. Cole is going to make sure they don't get it. But I need you to stay back here with your sister and keep her calm. You have to trust me. James looked from his mother to Cole. "The marshal is coming," Cole told the boy. 2 hours, maybe less. We just need to run out the clock." That little 8-year-old boy stood there and took it all in. Then he pulled his shoulders back and stood up tall, the same way his mother did when she meant business. He gave a firm nod. "Don't let them in," James said. "No, sir," Cole promised. Not 12 minutes later, a hard official knock rattled the door. Cole was already there. Eleanor was at the table, her hands where they could be seen, the rifle leaning against a wall 6 feet away. Close enough to matter, but not close enough to start something. Cole opened the door. Sheriff Harlan Driscoll stood there with 2 men behind him. The sheriff had the look of a man given a dirty job he just wanted done with. "Morning, Cole," Driscoll said, trying to sound official. "I've got a warrant here signed by the judge himself. We're looking for a woman named Eleanor McBride, wanted for stealing documents from the Peton Mining Company." He held out the paper, but Cole didn't move to take it. "Road's been closed, Harlan." "Blizzard," Cole said, his voice flat. "I'll need to look inside your house." "You got a search warrant to go with that one?" Cole asked. Driscoll paused just a bit too long. "That paper is for finding a person, Harlan, not for searching a man's home," Cole said. "You want to come inside, you need a whole other warrant. You've been the law long enough to know that." The sheriff's official act crumbled. "Cole," he said quietly, "don't make this harder than it has to be." "I'm not the one making anything harder," Cole said, his voice like iron. "I'm just standing in my own doorway. You need to ask yourself who you're making things hard for." One of Driscoll's younger deputies, looking like he was fresh out of patience, stepped forward. The sheriff cut him short. "Stand back," Driscoll said. The man froze. Driscoll looked at Cole, and his face held the shadow of a courage long gone. "I got a daughter," he said, his voice low. "Peton's got the paper on my house. If I don't do this—" "I know," Cole cut in. He'd known since he saw Driscoll's name, and the $400 figure next to it in the notebook. He knew it was from the same month the man's daughter was sick. "I know how it started, Harlan." A pained look flashed across Driscoll's face. "There's a federal marshal coming down the road right now," Cole said. "Less than 2 hours out. When he gets here, what you do next is going to matter a whole lot more than what you've done. You know your name is in that book. A federal court's going to look kinder on a sheriff who backed away from an illegal search than one who kicked in a door." The young deputy behind Driscoll went for his gun. But the sound that stopped him wasn't Cole's rifle. It was the dog, Deputy, who'd been quiet the whole time. The old dog stepped up next to Cole and let out a growl that rumbled deep in his chest. The man's hands stopped moving. "Don't," Driscoll told his man, his voice quiet but firm. He folded the warrant and tucked it in his coat, a man who'd finally made a choice he'd been putting off for 2 years. He gave Cole one last look, a mix of something like shame and relief. 2 hours, he said. Cole nodded. 2 hours. Driscoll turned and walked off the porch, his men following a moment later. Only then did Cole let out the breath he'd been holding. Eleanor was standing right behind him. "You heard?" he asked. "I heard," she said, holding his rifle. "It's how Peton works," Cole explained. "He finds a man's weakness and offers help. Then he owns that man body and soul." "Thomas wrote about it," Eleanor said softly. "He called it an architecture. Peton builds a cage of obligation around a man. She said the only way out is to make staying in that cage cost more than breaking out of it." "That's what just happened," Cole said. She looked at the door. He could still send a wire to Peton. He could, Cole agreed, but he didn't search this house when he had the men to do it. "That tells me which way the wind's blowing." The backroom door opened and the children came out. "They left?" James asked. Clara looked from the dog to her mother. "Deputy was very loud," she said, clearly impressed. "He sure was," Cole agreed. Clara went and sat right down by the old dog, who just sighed and put his head on his paws. "What will you do after?" Cole asked Eleanor later as she sat staring out the window. "After what?" she asked. "After Garrett gets here? After Peton's name is on a federal document that can't be buried?" She was quiet for a bit, looking down at her hands. "I want to teach," she said, her voice simple and sure. "I want to find a place with children who need a teacher." I want Clara to grow up knowing how to read any contract put in front of her. I want James to know there are good systems in this world because good people fought to make them that way. That's a powerful heap of wantin', he said gently. I've been saving it up, she replied. Cole looked at her, this woman who'd walked through a blizzard and faced down a sheriff without flinching. I think Thomas McBride, he said slowly, would have liked knowing you ended up someplace safe, with a good school for the children. She met his gaze, her chin trembling just a little. He would have liked knowing I wasn't running anymore, she whispered. Just then they heard horses on the north road. It wasn't Peaton's men. This was the sound of authority, steady and purposeful. Cole was at the window in a heartbeat. He saw 4 riders, and the noon sun glinted off a badge. Is that the good man? Clara asked from the floor. Eleanor crossed to the window, and a look of pure, gut-wrenching relief washed over her face. Yes, baby, she said. That's the good man. Cole opened the door. Marshal Thomas Garrett rode into the yard with 3 deputies. He looked like a man who'd been waiting for a long time and rode hard the second he got the call. He pulled his horse up and looked past Cole to Eleanor. Mrs. McBride, he said. Marshal, she answered. I believe you're looking for some documents concerning the Peaton Mining Company. I have Thomas's notebook, 2 full copies, and Cole Harrow's original investigation files. She said it plain and clear, 73 pages of evidence in all. Garrett looked at Cole. The original files. In the cedar chest, Cole said. Intact. Garrett dismounted. He was a compact man with tired eyes that saw everything. Then I reckon, he said, we've got some work to do. He stepped onto the porch, and Cole moved aside to let him pass into the cabin. Marshal Garrett was all business. He sat at that table and read every last page, Thomas's notebook, the Cleville files, and all the papers Eleanor had copied. He worked quiet and slow, making little marks in his own book with a pencil. He didn't ask a single question, just read. Young James sat at the other end of the table and watched the marshal, still as a stone. After nearly an hour, Garrett finally looked up from a page and spoke directly to the boy. Your father wrote this? Yes, sir, James said. He was an accountant. Garrett nodded slowly, his eyes going back to the page. He wrote like a lawyer, he said. It was a compliment from one professional to another. He saw every angle, documented every reason. He knew this was going to end up in a court. He always knew, James said, his voice soft. Eleanor turned from the window where she'd been standing guard. The names in that 3rd section, she said. The buyers. 3 of them are in the Billings District Land Office. I saw the records myself. The truth was all right there on the table, waiting. And inside that cedar chest, the names of 7 men from Cleville were finally about to be heard, all because of a good man's careful work and a strong woman who refused to let them be forgotten. All that was left was the hard and necessary work of justice. Garrett did not even look up from his papers. Judge Alderman signed the warrant for Driscoll this morning. I know. Alderman has been on my list for 14 months. Garrett turned another page. He just shot to the top of it. Cole poured his own coffee and stood by the door, just letting the marshal do his work. One of the deputies, a young red-headed fellow named Fitch, who could not have been more than 22, had already posted himself out on the porch without anyone telling him to. The other 2 were seeing to the horses. Nobody had mentioned Peaton's men hiding out in the trees, but everybody in that room knew they were out there, and they were on a clock of their own. The only real question was, whose clock was going to run out first? Mr. Hargrove. Garrett finally put the last page down. He squared up the stack of papers, real neat and slow, and looked at Cole. Tell me about the night you wrote that first Cleville report. Cole walked over to the table and sat. He told the story just like he told Eleanor, straight and simple, without making himself out to be some kind of hero. He talked about the proof he had gathered, the stories from the miners who made it out, and the copy of that inspection report. He told him about the night his boss handed him the watered-down version and told him to sign it. Garrett listened, just like he read, paying full attention, never interrupting. his pencil just moving every now and then in his little notebook. "The supervisor," Garrett said when Cole had finished. "Harlan Beaumont, from the Chicago office." "Yes, but he has been dead for 18 months now." Garrett laid it out plain, a carriage wreck up in Illinois. He said Piton has a man in Chicago who arranges these so-called accidents for folks who talk too much. We have been working that angle for a spell. He looked right at Cole. "Your testimony is the thread that ties his Chicago business to what he is doing in Montana. That makes it a federal conspiracy, and it means all those territorial judges Piton owns cannot touch it." The cabin was dead quiet. "So you have been building a case," Eleanor said, "just stating a fact." "For 16 months, Garrett answered. "I had bits and pieces, payments here, accidents there. It stopped looking like bad luck after the fourth one. But I never had the whole picture. I could not see how it all connected." He tapped Thomas's notebook. "Your husband, ma'am. He drew me the map." Eleanor stood still as a statue. "And he paid for it with his life." "Yes, ma'am, he surely did," Garrett said, not sugarcoating it one bit for her. "What your husband built is going to tear Piton's whole rotten empire down from the ground floor all the way to the top." Garrett paused for a moment. "But you need to know what is coming." Eleanor just said, "Tell me." "I am going to arrest Augustus Piton today, before he even knows we are here. But Piton has deep pockets. He has lawyers and a judge in Billings ready to go. The second I bring him in, they will do everything they can to tear you down. They will attack your good name, your marriage, and everything Thomas worked for. They will say you both made it all up. They will poke and prod at every corner of your life right there in open court." Eleanor walked to the table and sat, placing her hands flat on the wood. It was the look of a woman taking stock. "I was a school teacher for 9 years, she said, her voice steady. "I have 17 years of a good name any court can check on. I am 8 months along with my third child, and I have been on the run for 4 days. Last night I copied 73 pages of evidence by an oil lamp. I reckon my dedication to the truth will be clear enough." "What else?" A small smile, one he did not use much, touched Garrett's face. "I will need you in Billings for the federal hearing. It might take 3 or 4 weeks. You will swear to how Thomas kept his records and to the copies you made." He then looked at Cole. "I need you to confirm the Colville files and to tell them about the night your boss showed you the fake report." "When are you going after Piton?" Cole asked. "This afternoon. I aim to be in his main office before his men from this morning can get back to warn him." Garrett got to his feet. "I am leaving 2 of my men here to watch over y'all. With 2 federal badges on the porch, nobody is getting near this cabin." Cole nodded. Clara, the little girl, had been listening hard. She looked up at Garrett. "Are you going to put the bad man in jail?" she asked. Garrett looked down, a mite awkward like a man who is not around children much. "Yes, miss," he said. "Good," she answered, like the matter was settled. Garrett gathered the papers, keeping the originals and copies separate. Cole had given him oilskin to wrap them in. He tucked them inside his coat, a move he had perfected over 12 years of carrying important papers close to his chest. As he reached the door, Eleanor spoke. "Marshal." He stopped. "There is a man, Marcus Holt. He is running Piton's operation north of here. He is the one who ordered them to take out the braces at Claville." She said it plain, though it cost her. 300 men were in that mine. Garrett turned back. "He is in the notebook, page 14. It shows Piton paid Holt 6 weeks before the collapse for, quote, operational adjustments. Thomas believed that was Piton's way of saying to remove the safety supports." "It was," Cole added. 3 of the miners who survived said they were told the same thing. Garrett pulled out his own small notebook and wrote for a few seconds. "I will have a deputy at that north shaft by sunup tomorrow. Thank you, Mrs. McBride." "You should thank Thomas," she said. Garrett put on his hat and stepped outside, and they could hear him giving quiet orders to his men. The sound of the horses faded south, leaving a heavy quiet on the ranch. It was the kind of silence that follows after a storm you knew was coming has finally broken. James looked over at his mother. "Is it over?" he asked. Eleanor looked at the door, then back at her son, choosing her words with care. "The hardest part is," she said, "what is coming next is just a different kind of hard." The boy nodded, understanding. He turned to Cole. "Will you be there?" Cole took in the woman, the boy, and the small sleeping girl who had claimed his dog as her own. He thought of the notebook on the table that held their whole story. "Yes," he said, "I will be there." The afternoon crept by. The young deputy, Fitch, was 22 and from Ohio, a polite young man raised with good manners, and he aimed to honor them, even way out here. He offered to help with the horses, and Cole let him. Out in the barn, Fitch talked, not from nerves but steady, like a young fella in a situation bigger than he is used to. He spoke about the Garrett case and his brother who worked in a mine back home. Cole listened, thinking how Fitch was here helping a man trying to make those mines safer, and the boy had not yet connected those two things. When they came back inside, Eleanor sat at the table with her husband Thomas's notebook. She was looking at the back pages, where his handwriting was looser, more personal. She closed it gently when they walked in, not hiding it, just closing something private. "Clara is asleep," she said. "James is reading. He found my father's old surveying textbook from 1871 on your shelf. That boy of hers has a mind like a steel trap. He's been asking me about land surveying for 2 hours straight, questions I couldn't rightly answer." Cole watched Eleanor, a hint of warmth in her voice. "He's got Thomas's mind." She said the name easy-like, not all stiff and careful, like talking about a man who's gone from this world but not from the room. Cole sat down, the fire crackling a steady rhythm. Out on the porch, young Fitch stood guard, taking his duty seriously. Miles south, Garrett was riding hard with federal papers and a dead man's truth. "Can I ask you something?" Cole said, holding her gaze. He was thinking of the wreck on the ridge. "You had that knife stuck in the wagon floorboard before I ever got there. You were using it to stand." He let the words hang in the air. "You weren't about to stay down." "No," she admitted. "What was your plan?" She thought for a second. "Get the children moving north on foot, then draw those men and their lanterns south." "The rifle was in the snow, but I knew where. I was going to lead them on a chase, get the children clear." Her hands rested flat on the table. "I hadn't figured on what came after that." "Eleanor, that ain't a plan," Cole said softly. "That's a sacrifice." "It was all I had." She looked him square in the eye, no apology in her. 2 children, a notebook, and armed men just up the hill. "You fight with what you've got. You fight with what you've got," Cole repeated under his breath. He glanced at the cedar chest. "Thomas wrote you a letter telling you how to get through this. You read it, learned it by heart, and did everything he said. But when the road ran out, when you were on that ridge with that wagon busted, you wrote the next chapter yourself." Eleanor just looked at him for a long moment. What other choice did I have? It wasn't a challenge. It was a genuine question from a woman who'd never had another option to choose from. "None," Cole said. "There was nothing else to do. I'm not saying you were wrong. I'm just saying I saw it. I want you to know somebody saw it. Because folks who do big things alone in the dark tend to forget them when the sun comes up. The ordinary world comes back and makes what you did feel small." "It was not small," Cole said firmly. "What you did on that ridge, what you've been doing these past 4 days, and what Thomas did for 2 years before you. None of it was small, and I wanted someone to say that out loud before the government makes it official and the lawyers turn it into fancy language." He met her eyes. "It was extraordinary. You are extraordinary. And Thomas McBride knew it when he married you. And he knew it when he wrote that letter. He knew it was the truth, even if he didn't live to see it through." Eleanor was quiet for a good long while. Not the quiet of a person holding back, but the quiet that comes after a big truth has been spoken, and no words are big enough to follow it. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady in a new kind of way. It was the steadiness of someone who just set down a heavy load they'd been carrying all alone. "He used to say," she said, "that I was the only person he ever met who was more afraid of failing what mattered than of the fight itself." She looked at the closed notebook. He said it like it was a compliment. It took me a long while to understand that it was. Cole didn't say a thing. Silence was the best answer. A deep Montana blue, and the first stars were popping out over the snow line, sharp and clear. Fitch had come inside, eating cold biscuits at the table without a word of complaint. James came out with a textbook, peppering Fitch with questions about surveying. Then little Clara woke up, looked around, and decided she wanted another biscuit too. So, Cole made biscuits. It was the most normal hour that Cabin had seen since a woman with a hurt shoulder and 2 children had knocked the snow off her boots and stepped inside. There was a power in that ordinary moment, the kind that only comes after you've been through something terrible. The storm is over, the danger ain't gone, but it's at bay, and the fire is warm. Eleanor sat at the table drinking her coffee. She wasn't planning or writing. She just sat, watching her children. Every now and then, she'd look over at Cole with a look he was starting to understand. It was a look that said, I was all alone in this for so long, and now I'm not, and I don't rightly know what to do about it yet. He knew that look because he was feeling some version of it himself. Later, after the kids were asleep, Cole sat on the porch in the biting cold. He thought about the trial in Billings, about standing up in that federal court and telling the whole story of what happened out at Coveville. He wondered if he was ready. Then he decided being ready wasn't the point. It was necessary. That much had been decided back on that snowy ridge, when a woman who couldn't afford to stay down drove a knife into a board and stood up anyway. The door opened. Eleanor came out, bundled in her coat. She stood at the rail and just looked up at the stars. They stayed like that for a spell, not talking. It was a conversation all its own, the kind you have when words feel too small. 3 weeks in Billings, she said at last. 3 weeks, he agreed. After that. She wasn't asking, just thinking out loud. The children need a place to set down roots, she said. A school. Something that stays put. Montana's a good place for schools, Cole said. She gave him a sideways glance. You've been looking into it. I read, he said, plain and simple. Copper Falls has a school, he went on. Or it did. Teacher left last spring. Building's still there. Town's been trying to find a new one for 8 months. The quiet that followed had a weight to it. Cole, she said finally, are you telling me about a school or are you giving me a reason to stay? He looked at the stars, straight on, just like she was. I reckon I'm telling you both, he said, letting you decide which one is the answer you need. Eleanor didn't say anything for a long time. The night was cold and clear, the sky scrubbed clean by the blizzard. The baby's going to need a name, she said. That's true. I've been thinking on it for weeks and haven't landed on one. Thomas had a name picked out. He told me in a letter. He said if it was a girl, he wanted to name her for the first honest thing that happened after all the lies were done. She looked over at Cole. He wrote that before he knew how it would all end. He was writing about the hope of it, not the fact. He never got to see it become real. Cole looked at this woman who was about to stand up in a federal courthouse and speak the truth where it finally mattered. What was the name? He asked. Verity, she said. It means truth. The wind whispered between them, cold and clean off the snow. It carried the kind of deep silence you only find on a Montana winter night, full of promise for what's waiting underneath all that white. That's a good name, Cole said. Eleanor looked at the stars a moment longer, then turned to go inside. Cole held the door for her, and the warmth from the cabin rushed out to greet them both. Inside, the children were sleeping and the fire was burning steady. They left for Billings 4 days later once the roads were clear. Word had already come that Peyton had been arrested, taken from his main office without a fight. The morning before they set out, Sheriff Driscoll came to the ranch. He came by himself with no badge on his coat and his hat in his hands. He looked like a man who had spent a few hard days alone with his own thoughts. I want to speak to Mrs. McBride, he said. Cole went inside and called her name. She came to the doorway and stood in her coat, her hands still at her sides, and waited. She looked at Harlan Driscoll and did not make it easy for him. I knew about the notebook, Driscoll started. I knew Thomas McBride was keeping records, and I knew Peaton wanted them. When they told me he had an accident, I filed the report they gave me. I did not ask the questions I already knew the answers to. He looked her right in the eye. I am sorry, Mrs. McBride, for the report and for all of it. Eleanor was quiet for a long moment. Did you have a choice? She asked. Not a good one, Driscoll said, but I had one. She held his gaze. Then I accept your apology, Sheriff. And I suggest that when the court asks you about that warrant, you tell them exactly what you told me. The court will know the difference. Driscoll nodded slowly, put his hat back on, and gave Cole one last look. He was not asking for anything, just a look between two men who knew a line had been redrawn. Then he rode back to town. Cole came and stood beside Eleanor. That was generous, he said. It was accurate, she replied. There is a difference. The road to Billings took 2 days. Clara sang songs she made up as she went along, and James sat beside his mother, watching the land pass by like he was memorizing a map. On the second evening, with the lights of Billings glowing in the distance, Eleanor spoke without warning. Thomas proposed to me in a schoolroom. She said he had come to fix the stovepipe. He was terrible at it. It took him 3 visits over 2 weeks to get it right. The warmth in her voice filled the cold air. It was a bittersweet memory, the kind that hurts good. On his 3rd visit, he confessed he was making things worse on purpose, just to have a reason to see her again. She just stared at the road ahead. She told him that was the sorriest excuse for a courtship she had ever heard. He replied that being efficient was never the point. The point was just showing up. He showed up every single day for the rest of his life. Riding beside her in the quiet dark, Cole said, "He sounds like a man who deserved to have his work finished." Cole said he was. She said he is. They rode into Billings the next morning. Garrett was there waiting with 2 deputies, looking like a man whose clock was ticking way too fast. He told them Peaton's lawyers were trying to get the whole case thrown out. They claimed Thomas McBride's papers were private property, taken without the right warrant. Garrett walked alongside Cole's horse. The new judge, a federal man named Forsythe, said no, but they are going to fight the history of every single document. He looked straight at Eleanor. They plan to say your copies are nothing but lies. Eleanor's voice was steady. Then I will recite the originals from memory, word for word if I have to. Garrett gave her that same look he had at the ranch, like a man figuring just how short to cut the fuse on a stick of dynamite. The hearing is the day after tomorrow. Good, she said. I have been ready for 8 months. The federal courthouse in Billings was one of those stone buildings made to look like it would stand forever. Cole had been in courtrooms before and was never much bothered by them. What got his attention this time was the heavy silence when Eleanor McBride walked in. The room was full of lawyers in their fine suits and folks from all over who had heard the whispers and wanted to see the whole story for themselves. She walked in with her back ramrod straight, wearing a simple dark dress bought with the last of her husband's emergency money. You could see the writer's callus on her finger and the old ink stain on her knuckle, and she was 8.5 months with child. She took her seat in the witness chair like a woman who knew exactly where she belonged and had no plans on leaving. Peaton's lawyer, a man named Voss from Chicago, was expensive. He had the kind of smug confidence that comes from making honest people doubt themselves for 20 years. He let Eleanor tell her story for a solid hour, about the notebook and the copies she made. Then he stood up, looking at her with the practiced calm of a man who thinks he has an easy fight ahead. "Mrs. McBride," Voss began, "you say you read these company ledgers, but you have no legal schooling. Why should this court trust your understanding of these documents?" Eleanor looked him square in the eye. "I taught math and writing for 9 years. I can read a list of numbers, and I can read a contract. What I read did not take a fancy lawyer. It just took literacy and attention. I have both." She continued, My copies came from the notebook I held in my hand, and from my memory where the pages were torn. She pulled a paper from her folder. Let me prove it. You give me any page from that ledger, and I will tell you what it says before you even open it. A low rumble went through the crowd. Voss glanced at his papers, then at his table, then to the judge. That will not be necessary, he said. Judge Forsythe spoke up from the bench, his voice calm. I believe it might be. The judge looked like he had been waiting a good long while for a case just like this one, and he was not about to be rushed. Voss chose a page from Piton's ledger. He read one line. Eleanor repeated it back perfectly, right down to the date in the corner and the account number at the bottom. Voss tried another page. She recited that one too, even pointing out two little notes that Voss himself almost missed. The rumble in the gallery got a little louder. Mrs. McBride, Voss said, his voice different now. He was not shaken, but he was readjusting like a man who just discovered his map was all wrong. Your husband, he tried, was very emotionally caught up in this. Is it not possible his notes show what he wanted to find, not the simple facts? Thomas was an accountant, she said plainly. Accountants write down what the numbers say. The numbers he wrote down came from Mr. Piton's own books. She paused, letting her words sink in. If the documents show a conclusion was already decided, it was Augustus Piton who decided it when he wrote them, not my husband when he copied them. For the next 40 minutes, Voss tried to trip her up. Eleanor met every question with the same calm, steady truth of a woman who knew her business better than the high-dollar lawyer paid to fight it. Cole's turn came on the second day. He sat in that same chair and told the court plainly what happened at Claville. He talked about the falsified report his boss told him to sign. He spoke the 7 names that had been taken out of his original report. He said each one clear as a bell, and the courtroom got quiet, the way a room does when something lost has finally been returned to its rightful place. Voss questioned him for an hour. Cole answered every question with the same directness Eleanor had. When Voss asked why he stayed quiet for 2 years, Cole answered, because I was wrong and I knew it. But knowing I was wrong was not enough to make me act right. Not until a woman in a blizzard stuck a knife in a wagon bed and used it to pull herself up. I figured if she could do that, I could do this. The gallery was dead silent. Voss sat down. On day 3, Garrett took the stand and laid out 16 months of hard police work, proving the whole corrupt system. He spoke for 4 hours, slow and steady, like a man who had been building something for a long time, and was finally going to make every single word count. Through it all, Piton just sat there in his expensive suit between his lawyers. He looked like a man watching the collapse of a building he thought he owned, still trying to figure a way to walk out clean from the rubble. Cole had seen that look before on men who build their fortunes, thinking the people they hurt are too scared to ever speak the truth. He was wrong. They always are. The verdict was delivered on the 5th day. Guilty on 11 counts, including criminal negligence leading to death at Claville and widespread corruption. Hall was found guilty on 7 counts of his own. Judge Alderman had already been arrested. He made a deal and started naming names. 3 of those names belonged to men sitting right there in the gallery, who were quietly escorted out by federal marshals. The verdict was read while Eleanor sat in the gallery between Cole and James. Little Clara was asleep against her side. Piton would appeal, they knew, but for now he would be held without bail. The judge's voice read the counts, and Eleanor sat perfectly still. James found her hand and held it. She did not cry. She sat with her husband's notebook in a bag at her feet and let the truth settle for a full minute. Then she let out a long, slow breath, like a woman releasing a heavy weight she had been carrying for 8 hard months. Outside on the courthouse steps, Garrett came to stand with them. He shook Cole's hand, then looked at Eleanor with pure respect. The dynamite had been lit, and it had done its job. Your testimony was the thing that held it all together, he told Eleanor after the trial. Without that notebook, and without you on that stand, their lawyer would have found a way out of it. Thomas built the case, but you are the one who delivered it. Eleanor looked him square in the eye. The 7 men from Claville, she asked. Will their names be part of the official record? Every last one, Garrett promised. In the verdict and in the federal file. Their names will be on every piece of paper this case creates from now on. She gave one firm nod. Then it is done. James looked at Cole. What do we do now? He asked. Cole looked at the boy, his mother, and his little sister, who was studying the big columns of the courthouse. Now, Cole said, we go home. And they headed back to Copper Falls. By the first week of December, winter had settled in for good over the territory. The snow was the kind that wasn't going anywhere until March. Just like Cole said, the old schoolhouse was still standing solid and well built. That first afternoon, Eleanor went to check it out herself, while Cole watched the children back at the ranch. She returned with snow on her boots and a supply list written on a scrap of brown paper. Cole looked it over. You will need another bookshelf, he said. I know. Can you build one? I can build two. She met his eyes across the table. Cole, she said, and he waited. Thomas showed up every single day, she said, holding his gaze. I need you to know that is what I need. Not a grand rescue. Just someone who shows up. Cole did not look away. Eleanor, he said, I walked a lame horse 4 miles in a blizzard, stood on a porch with a shotgun for 12 hours, and testified in a federal court. I reckon I know how to show up. And then he saw it. The real woman underneath all that control. She reached out and took his hand, her grip hard and certain. He held on tight. Verity Callahan was born on December 21st, the longest night of the year. Clara said it was perfect, because that meant important people should have the whole night to themselves. She came into the world screaming and strong, with her mother's dark hair and her father's gift for making herself understood. And Cole held her first. Eleanor's hands were still shaking, and someone needed to be steady. That was something Cole knew how to do. He looked at that little red face and thought about Thomas McBride, writing a name on paper by lamplight, trying to leave some truth in the world before his time ran out. Verity, Eleanor said from the bed, her voice tired but fierce. Her name is Verity. Cole brought the baby to her. Eleanor held her daughter for the first time, looking like a woman who had fought through 8 impossible months to earn that very moment. James stood in the doorway with Clara asleep on his shoulder. He looked at his mother and his new sister, and for the first time in a long, long time, the worry left his eyes. They just rested. The school opened in January with 11 students. Eleanor told them all the same thing on the first day. If you can read a document, you can understand it. And if you understand it, no one can use it against you without you knowing. Word gets around fast in small territories. By February, there were 19 students. Eleanor McBride, who became Eleanor Hargrove on a quiet Sunday in February, wrote back to the school board and told them exactly what was happening. She was teaching the children to read everything. Cole built that second bookshelf in March. He built a third one in April when her book supply grew faster than anyone expected, which led to the kind of argument that ends in laughter between two people who have been through the fire together. Garrett wrote from Billings. Peaton's appeal was denied, and Holt's conviction was upheld. The federal record was permanent. The northern shaft was closed down, pending an inspection Garrett himself oversaw. He had also filed a separate document, thanks to Thomas's notebook, listing every single person harmed by the Peaton Mining Company between 1873 and 1878. Driscoll turned in his badge and took a job at a feed store 1 county over. One morning in late spring, with the ranch full of life, Eleanor sat on the porch steps. She had her coffee in one hand and Thomas's notebook open in her lap. Not the evidence pages, but the personal ones in the back. Cole came and sat beside her on the steps. She did not close the book. He wrote about you, she said quietly. She turned to the last written page from November before the accident and held it so he could see. It was Thomas McBride's careful handwriting, the hand of a man who knew he might be writing his last words. He wrote that if the worst happened, the one man he trusted to have the courage to use the proof was a former Pinkerton agent named Cole Hargrove, who had walked away from a job rather than sign his name to a lie. "He wrote that he did not know how to find you," Eleanor said softly. "He wrote that he hoped you would find Eleanor instead." Cole was quiet for a long moment. The Montana spring morning was warm and bright. Through the open window, Verity's voice demanded something, and Clara's voice answered, explaining the ways of the world to her new little sister. "We heard James's boots hit the porch planks. He stopped short when he saw his mother and Cole on the steps, and made the quiet choice to give them their space." Eleanor finally closed the notebook. She held it with both hands, the same way she had clutched it through the worst of the storm and the whole ordeal at the courthouse. Then she placed it beside her on the step, real careful-like. She wasn't letting it go, just letting herself breathe outside of it for a spell. Her eyes drifted to the field, where the horses moved in the new morning light. The fence Cole had fixed back in March stood straight and solid. "He found you," she said, speaking the words right into the air. It was a truth that had finally found its voice. Cole reached out and took her hand. Thomas McBride never failed to show up. And in that notebook, with the names he refused to let the world forget, he was showing up still. "Some people," Eleanor had once told her students, "leave the world with less truth in it. Thomas McBride left it with more." That was the long and short of it. He was a man who kept his word to the truth right up to the very end, and she was the woman who saw it the rest of the way home. Together they made certain that what was done in the dark was dragged out into the daylight. They named it, they recorded it, and they set it in stone where it could never be lost again. And that was enough. In fact, that was everything. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. We believe that great stories can change lives, and we are committed to bringing you content that matters. Thank you for being part of our community.